Amanda, can we start?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me introduce first both of the forums. We have arranged this event in collaboration. First of all, I will introduce the forum, that is Society for Endangered Languages Pakistan. Like it was founded in February 2021, and the aim is to promote linguistic diversity in Pakistan. As you know, that Pakistan is highly linguistically diverse. Altogether, 77 to 80 languages are spoken in this small state. But it's highly linguistically fractured as well because of the dominant languages, few dominant languages, and other languages, they suffer at the cost of these languages. So the very aim of the society is to work with communities speaking minority languages, also major but endangered languages. And the aim is to save these languages from extinction. We organize different web talks, workshops related to language endangerment in order to create awareness among scholars about the importance of linguistic diversity. And now I would like to introduce a teacher development webinar. It's also a forum. This is a forum, and its initiative is using the rise in online professional development to connect people from around the world with opportunities which they may not have had due to old normal or face-to-face conferences, etc. This project supports teachers to deliver engaging lessons via online and blended approaches by sharing different webinar opportunities and resources. Now I request Mr. Amanullah to introduce Professor David Crystal to our participants. Mr. Amanullah, please.
I'm really honored, privileged, and it's an honor, privilege, and pleasure to introduce eminent speaker, Professor David Crystal. Professor David Crystal is Honorary Professor of Linguistics at the University of Bengal and works from his home in Holyhead, North Wales, as a writer, editor, lecturer, and broadcaster in language and linguistics. He joined the new Department of Linguistics at Reading in 1965, becoming Professor of Linguistic Science there in 1975. From 1984, he has worked as an independent scholar. He is author of over 100 books on various aspects of English language, including the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language, now in its 3rd edition. His latest book is Let's Talk, How English Conversation Works, published in 2020. A complete list of his publications can be found at his website, www.davidcrystal.com. It's really an honor to have you at Teacher Development Webinars and Society for Endangered Languages Pakistan. Professor David Crystal, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's a delight to be with you. This is such an unusual occasion. It isn't every day that we find somebody around the world starting an organization like the one you've just been talking about, Turab. It's wonderful to see that kind of evolution of a local society with concern for endangered and minority languages. There ought to be one in every country in the world, and several countries do have them. But yours, I think, is one of the latest. So it's a real delight to be able to, well, help publicize the fact that you exist, I suppose, and deal with any questions that you might have for me. Do you have some ready?
Yeah, we have questions. As I mentioned that we have a lot of questions, but I randomly selected some of the questions which we can cover in this presentation. I'm sorry for those questions, for those people whose questions are not included in this lecture or in this talk series. As you know that it's really impossible to include all questions because more than 1,500 people registered. So the very first question is, on time of crisis such as COVID-19 pandemic and the recent Ukraine war, how can we strongly argue for language endangerment and gain support for revitalization efforts?
Well, I don't see the recent crises as doing anything different really from the crisis that has been with us for so long. Let's begin by reflecting on when this whole awareness of language endangerment started. It really began in the 1990s. Those of us who were teaching linguistics earlier, as you mentioned in your introduction, we always knew that there were some languages in the world that were endangered. This is a normal fact of life. It's been going on ever since languages started. But nobody was aware that of the extent to which so many languages in the world were endangered. So the concept of a crisis, that there's something really dramatic affecting the world's languages, is not something that I associate particularly with the current situation in politics or the COVID situation. It's been an evolution over the last 30 years. And it was the extent of the crisis that got everybody's attention when the first surveys were being done in the 1990s, and organizations like Ethnologue online were building up their information database. It was a real surprise to me, and I think to everybody, to realize that the figure of endangerment around the world was something like 50%. I mean, some people said it was much more. I remember Michael Krauss saying it could be as much as 80%. And then there were others who said, oh no, that's not so much. It's more like 20 or so percent. So in the end, a kind of middle of the road figure emerged of about 50% of the world's languages. And that was unprecedented information as far as I was concerned, and much greater than the environmental crisis that what everybody was aware of. I mean, when you ask people what's happening in the world environmentally, and they say, oh, all the species are dying out, all the plants and the animals and so on. But actually, when you go to the statistics there, it's only about 2 or 3% of species that are endangered. Well, with language, it's 50% or more or less, you see. And so it was a real shock to the system to realize that there were so many such languages involved. And as a result, that crisis has been sharpened over the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, at the beginning, it was really rather vague. And people were saying, well, 50% of the languages dying out over the next 100 years. That's a language dying every 2 weeks on average. And that was the figure that got into the press. And everybody thought, you know, language dying every 2 weeks. Well, more recent research has suggested that it isn't quite as frequent as that. Yeah, I don't know whether any of you out there know the big handbook that came out a couple of years ago, the Oxford Handbook of Endangered Languages. Big, thick book. And in the early chapters of that book, there is a revaluation of the statistic I just mentioned, and the current wisdom that there's a language becoming extinct around the world, the last native speaker dying about every 3 months or so, which is much better than 2 weeks, but it's still, of course, a terrible, terrible crisis. So we are indeed talking about a situation where we need to bring as much attention as possible, first of all, to the existence of the problem, which we can talk about later if there are questions on that. And secondly, to methods where we can either document or, as you said earlier, to revitalize these languages around the world. And so the current situation is one where I think we're now aware of the facts of the situation, and we're turning our heads, all of us, all around the world now, to ways in which we can do something about it.
Thank you. And the second question is how to cope with political and economic reasons of the language endangerment.
You mean the reasons why languages become endangered? Effectively, it's a mix of everything, really. There are all sorts of reasons why a language might become endangered. Everything from a physical crisis, you know, a tsunami hits a village on a coast somewhere in the world, and the village is wiped out, and with it goes the language. You know, that sort of situation has happened repeatedly through history. And there are political reasons, of course. Over history, some cultures have denied the right of languages to exist, and as a result, those languages have disappeared. But the vast majority of cases that we're dealing with today are due to a very natural phenomenon, really, which is a reflex of political and cultural and social movement. Language has no independent existence from the societies that give rise to it. So when we talk about language life and language death and language use and so on, we're talking about the human beings who use those languages and the factors that govern their motivations. And what we see repeatedly around the world is a phenomenon of power, with the language associated with one power group, or sometimes more than one, entering into a situation where they feel that power to be threatened by the existence of other groups within society. And so as a result, their language dominates, and the other groups' languages tend to become less important and may indeed eventually become unused or politically made extinct, banned, or something of that kind. It's a very natural situation. It doesn't have to result in that kind of scenario, but it's one that we see repeated everywhere, especially as a result of colonialism over the last 200 or 300 years, where a dominant language enters a community and the indigenous languages of that community as a result suffer. Now, people often say, well, English is the cause of all of this. Well, no, it isn't. English is indeed the cause as a result of English language imperialism in many countries, such as Australia, for example, or Canada, or the United States. But when you look at this balance between dominant and other languages around the world, you can see that any dominant language is likely to have this effect. So in Africa, Swahili, for example, is a dominant language in many places, and the minority languages there are threatened by Swahili. In China, Chinese has been a threat to minority languages there. And so we could go around the world, and especially to your part of the world, where, as you've already mentioned, certain powerful languages are making it difficult for the smaller languages to maintain their existence. So it's a mixture of it's primarily political reasons, reflecting political and social history, but economics is also never very far away. Because imagine now an enlightened country where everybody is aware that there is language diversity and they want to maintain it. Now, that's a scenario which fortunately is increasingly being seen around the world, thanks to initiatives from the United Nations and UNESCO, aware that language diversity is a very important part of cultural heritage. Now, imagine a situation where we're in a country where there is an enlightened awareness and an acceptance of the need to foster linguistic diversity. And immediately you're faced with an economic situation, because in order to foster that diversity, there has to be cash. It costs money to maintain diverse languages. It's money well spent, and we can talk about that in a little while. Money well spent. But you've got to persuade a government that it is worth spending. And you have to, in all sorts of respects, the minority language has to have a public presence. It has to be taught in schools. That means getting materials together and all the practical factors that need to be there in order for a language to be present within a community publicly and to grow, especially with young people. And we can talk about that again in a few minutes' time. But so there is a combination, I think, of political and economic factors involved here.
Thank you. Third question is, what does cultural performances play in preserving language? And as many indigenous languages are oral and performative, the shift in the medium and the exposure of community to advanced technology has created more opportunities for documentation and revitalization, or widened the gap between the community and the traditional performative practices.
Yes, the community is absolutely essential here. There are three factors that are needed for a minority or endangered language to succeed. One is top-down interest on the part of the local or national government, as I've just mentioned. That's essential. If the government is not interested, then one is in a very difficult situation. The second factor is, if that you call that top-down, then there is bottom-up. And bottom-up here means that the community itself must want the endangered language to survive. Now, you might think, well, that's obvious. Of course the community will. Well, it's not obvious, actually. When you go around the world, you do find some communities who actually don't care very much. You know, it's God's will, as it were. You know, so our language is dying. Well, let it die. Why should we let it? Well, because there are other languages around that are going to be more useful to us. They're going to give us a better quality of life. The dominant language is the one to go for because I'll get a better job. My family will be better looked after, and so on. And so there is a kind of laxity or understandable lack of interest in some parts of the world about preserving the endangered language. And the third factor, of course, is the cash that I mentioned a few moments ago. But let's concentrate on the community for a few moments. This is very short-term thinking, that when a community says, well, we need a better quality of life, so let's go for it with the dominant language of the community and not bother so much about our local language. This is short-term thinking. There have now been several studies which show what happens, and it takes 3 generations for the realization to dawn that that initial reaction is wrong. What happens is this. The first generation says, I need my family to be better off, and so I will make sure that they learn the dominant language of the community. I don't speak it very well, but my children will. So they make sure that the children go to a school or get training so that they learn, for example, English as their main language of expression. So the children grow up bilingual. They have the ancestral language, the indigenous language, which they got from their parents on the one hand, and they now have the other language, which they've learned in school, and they've become bilingual. More so than their parents, you see, who did not know the dominant language well. Those children then grow up. They now have the 2 languages. As a result of knowing the dominant language, they now do have a better quality of life. They've got a house and a television set and whatever it might be. They then have their children. And as far as the children of that second generation is concerned, the parents are saying, it's really the dominant language that is now the language of the home, the language of the local school, the language of the society, and so on. The ancestral language is in the distance somewhere. The children of that third generation typically grow up knowing only the dominant language. and forgetting, as it were, the other language. And they now have a very good quality of life as well. And that leads to the scenario when either that generation or their children, the fourth generation, comes along, they now are not threatened by economic deprivation. And that's the point at which they sit back and say, who are we? What is our identity? Where do we come from? We have the time now. We have the relaxation now. We're not worried anymore about surviving economically. We have survived. So let's think about who we are. And they look back at themselves and at their parents and their grandparents and say, we belong to that community. We belong to that language. Grandpa, why did you let our language die? Why didn't you teach us our language? That's the point at which there is criticism of the older generations for allowing the ancestral language to disappear from their lives. And that's what I mean by short-term thinking. If you think long-term into the third or even fourth generation, then you see a situation where the people themselves regret the loss of the ancestral language. And that is why it is so important in this whole concept of revitalization to accompany that notion with the notion of documentation. In other words, get that language written down, and not just written down, of course, but recorded as well. This day and age, of course, with the internet and mobile phones and everything, you can have a complete auditory experience of the language as well as traditionally a written experience of it. Let's get the language documented, because once it is documented, and by that I mean, grammars and dictionaries and encyclopedias and folk tales and everything to do with the language recorded somewhere or other, then if the language is lost, it can be revived by going to that documentation. And there have been several examples of this around the world. There's a language called Kaurna, Kaurna, an Aboriginal language of Australia, which died out at the end of the 19th century, I think it was, round about late 1800s, early 1900s. Died out completely, but now it's allowed again. It's alive again. Being taught in schools, there is a new community. It's an evolved language now. They've got words for television and things that they didn't have 100 years ago. But the point is that would not have been possible without the documentation that took place on that language a century or so ago. And so the community is extremely important here, but it's important for the community to think long-term as well as short-term. Short-term, there may not be the interest or not so much interest, or it's a slog to try and get people interested, to generate that interest, often because there isn't any money there to do it. But if they start thinking long-term, they can see the merit of taking that extra effort to get local interest in their language. And that is why an organization such as yours is so important, because it can show people how to do this. The worst thing that can happen to an endangered community is to think that they are on their own, that they are isolated, that they are the only people in the world who have this problem. They are not. The endangered language situation affects 2,000 to 3,000 languages around the world. And other places have developed enormously ingenious ways of attacking this problem. We can talk about that in a minute, if you like. So it's important for them to become aware that their problem is shared by lots of other people. And that gives a kind of boost mentally. And that can generate an awful lot of local activism. And it's the activism that will guarantee that there is some community force that will maintain the language within that community.
Thank you. The next question is from Professor Gilad Sukerman. You might be familiar with the name, the professor of endangered languages based in Adelaide. He argues that any successful language revival results in a hybrid that cross-fertilizes the language being revived and the revivalist's mother tongue. Do you agree?
I didn't quite catch that. The internet sort of went down briefly. Could you repeat it?
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah.
Professor Gilad Sukerman argues, is it fine now?
Yeah, that's okay. I can hear you now.
Okay. Professor Gilad Sukerman argues that any successful language revival results in a hybrid that cross-fertilizes the language being revived and the revivalist's mother tongues. Do you agree?
Yes. Yeah, I live in Wales and I have exactly this situation here. English is the dominant language, Welsh is the indigenous language. So I have two languages, I have English and I have Welsh, but I learnt Welsh as a second language, not as a mother tongue. 100 years ago, Welsh was dying out. And then as a result of the activism that took place in the 1970s and 1980s, it revived and it is now a very successful language, spoken by something like 20% of the community, which makes Welsh one of the real success stories of the endangered language movement of recent times. But the interesting thing is that when you get a language that is developing successfully in that way, it inevitably changes. And you get influences on it that were not there before. And this can cause tension within the community. And we've seen it here very clearly in Wales, and I suspect it would also be the case in many of the languages that you're dealing with in Pakistan and elsewhere. What happens is this. The people who are the older people in the community, the elders of the community, have a very clear sense of what their language is because of the way in which they remember it. And they remember it because of the way they were taught, and that will reflect a very conservative view. In the case of Wales, it was the language of the Bible and the language of other traditional, important developments in the history of Wales. So they have a very clear, a sort of purist attitude towards what their language is. Now along comes a revivalist movement, and that revivalist movement is perhaps led by them, but also will involve younger people who want the language taught in schools, for example, in community centres, want young people to be involved. And this is absolutely critical, because there is one fundamental fact about all endangered languages, and it is this, that if there is no intergenerational transmission, that language will disappear. Now, by intergenerational transmission, I mean teach it to the kids. So if the kids don't get enthused about the language, no matter how much activism there is in society, you're wasting your time. Because you're told that the older people will die and that generation will die, and the young people, if they have not been enthused, will not be able to carry on with the language. So it is absolutely crucial that efforts should be made to generate enthusiasm amongst the younger sectors of an endangered language society. And here's the problem, that the young people are aware of what is cool around the world. They know that English is cool. They know that other languages are cool and their language is not cool. So as a result, they start to mix languages. They allow words and sometimes grammatical constructions and pronunciations from the dominant languages, and I use English as the example. Here in Wales, that's what's happened. You will have perhaps other dominant languages having the same effect. And they start to mix the languages. There are all sorts of dismissive names that you give to this kind of situation. In my case here in Wales, the mixture of Welsh and English is called Wenglish. Wenglish, you see. Well, it doesn't mean it's 50-50. What it means is that the Welsh has a mixture of English words and other influences inside the Welsh that the older people in the community would not know about, would not experience, or even if they are aware of it, they don't like it. And so here is this tension. An older sector of the community who maintains that the only proper kind of Welsh is the pure kind of Welsh, and a younger sector in the community who maintains that that's old-fashioned. We need to have a living kind of Welsh, which has more relevance to the present-day world. And if there are more English words in that Welsh, then what's wrong with that? And the elders say, oh, no, that's, and you get this tension. In other words, one of the biggest dangers to an endangered language actually comes from within, not from outside at all. All these economic and political and other factors I talked about earlier, in a sense, are irrelevant here. If the younger members of the community are turned off their language by the older members, then that language is on a course for disappearance. What should happen, and it's happened here in Wales, is that there needs to be a consensus, a kind of balance, a kind of mutual respect. The young people have to recognize that the older generation's language has to be respected. The older generation, and this is more difficult, has to recognize that the younger generation's language has to be respected. Now, people sometimes say, that's very confusing, isn't it, to have two kinds of language, or maybe even three kinds of language, all existing at the same time? No, this is normal. This is absolutely the normal state of affairs for any language around the world, dominant or minority or endangered. Any language is a multiplicity of varieties, of dialects, of styles. Take English as the case in point. English is the perfect example of a hybrid language. How many words are there in English? Well, nobody knows, but the big dictionaries suggest at least 1 million and probably many more than that. But 80% of that vocabulary comes from a hybrid situation. Only 20% of English vocabulary is Germanic, which is where the English language came from Anglo-Saxon. The other 80% are words from French and Italian and Spanish and your languages from the Asian continent and Chinese. And so over 400 languages have had their words borrowed into English. English is a supreme example of a hybrid language. And as a result, you can now play with English and either use lots of those words or not so many of those words. And the perfect example of this is Shakespeare. Shakespeare could not have written what he wrote without the awareness that there are three basic types of vocabulary in English: the Anglo-Saxon original vocabulary, the French vocabulary that came in the Middle Ages, and the Latin vocabulary that came in the Renaissance, which you can see in all kinds. Those of you who have learned English, all of you out there, you know this, don't you? Because there are triplets of words: fire, flame, conflagration. Fire is an Anglo-Saxon word. Flame is a French word. Conflagration is a Latin word. Or ask, question, interrogate. Ask is an Anglo-Saxon word. Question is a French word. Interrogate is a Latin word. And you feel the difference between these different words, don't you? One is more popular, one is more learned. And Shakespeare, of course, uses these differences in his plays. Well, so do you and I use these differences also. And we can speak in a very Anglo-Saxon-y way with ask and fire, or we can speak in a rather intellectual way with interrogate and conflagration. You feel the stylistic difference, don't you? Now, endangered languages are in the same situation. Anybody who says that the influx of new words into an endangered language is a bad thing, fail to recognize that actually it's an enrichment. The language will change its character. Indeed, it will, but that's inevitable. The only languages that don't change are dead ones. All languages change by borrowing and other factors. And English is the success story of our time, without a doubt, in terms of number of users around the world. But all languages are in the same situation as English, and endangered languages are no different. So, I recognize the fact of hybridity. I recognize that it raises tensions, but there is a solution here if you compare your endangered situation with that of, for example, English.
Thank you so much. And the other question is related to English. Is English really a killer language?
Is really a what, sorry?
Killer language, killer, murderer.
A killer language. No, I don't
Yes.
use words like killer and so on. There has never been, there are languages that are killer languages where there is a deliberate attempt to ban languages. That's not the English situation. But why isolate English? As I mentioned earlier on, any dominant language around the world could be, in inverted commas, a killer language. Let's take South America, for instance. All the indigenous languages of South America are endangered, all of them. Why? Because of English? No, because of Spanish and Portuguese being the dominant languages there. I mentioned Swahili in Africa as a dominant language. And you can go, and Arabic is a dominant language, and Chinese is a dominant language, and Hindi is a dominant language. And so we could go on around the world and call them all killer languages if you want, but you don't isolate any one. The only reason why English is being cited so often is because of history and the British Empire and all of that. And it is the case that because of the power politics of the time, English became a language that people found themselves needing to use and also wanting to use. That's the difference, you see. That's why the term killer is inappropriate. A lot of people want to use the dominant language. They don't want to be killed, as it were. It doesn't make sense. They want to use it. So I avoid terms like killer and try to recognize the realities of the situation and focus the attention not so much on the history, on the past. Whatever the reasons were for the present day situation, well, those reasons are gone. What we need to do now is focus creatively and ingeniously on ways in which we can restore endangered languages to a state of health, if the community want it and if the factors are there to enable it to happen, or at the very least, if the language is so seriously endangered that it's going to disappear, to make sure that we document it for future generations to be able to restore, to go back to it one day if they wish to.
Thank you. And the next question is, how can translanguaging prevent language endangerment and promote language revitalization?
A lot here now depends on the audience that we're talking about. Let's go back for a moment. First of all, let's go back to the children. Intergenerational transmission, absolutely crucial. So how do you enthuse young people? That's the question. Well, It's difficult, isn't it? If you have teenagers, and it's the teenage population that we're talking about here mainly, because the teenagers are the parents of the next generation of children. And if the teenagers are not enthused, then it's all over. The game is over. So how do you enthuse teenagers? I wish I knew the answer to that question for any culture. But the one thing I do know is that all teenagers these days, they all have a mobile phone, or at least, you know, if they can afford it, they've got a mobile phone. They know about the internet. They know about Facebook. They know about Twitter. They know about YouTube, Instagram, and all the other things. That is their world. So it's absolutely crucial for any organization in a country or in a community involved in resuscitating, revitalizing an endangered language to use electronic media to the maximum extent to make sure that the kids get involved. And I've seen this happen in several countries. It happens here in Wales now. There are lots of online youth groups in which the kids get together and talk in Welsh about whatever their interests are. There are pop groups here that sing pop songs through the medium of Welsh, and all that kind of thing, using the internet as much as possible and focusing on the things that interest the young people through the endangered language is absolutely essential if that generation is to become enthusiastic about their language. And I've seen it not just here, but I've seen it in other places too. Digital storytelling, for example. I mean, that's a lovely concept. Happened in several American Indian languages, where the young people who said, yeah, we want to help, how can we help? Go and ask the elders to tell their stories and use digital mechanisms in order to do it. And so the money was spent on buying appropriate equipment, film equipment and so on. And the kids got very excited about this and went out and said, let's make some films, let's make some films. What can we make a film about? Go and ask the elders to tell you their stories. So they did. And that's the kind of, you know, practical initiative that can help enormously. So that's one thing, enthusing the young people. But the other thing, which is more important than this in many ways, because it affects the whole of the community, is to get the arts involved in the revitalization of the language. Now, by the arts, I mean every art, the whole panoply of the arts. I mean film, I mean dance, I mean theater, I mean everything. You know what an art is: painting, novels, the lot. And here's the interesting question. How often do we encounter the arts being used as a means of publicizing and therefore helping to ensure revitalization of an endangered language? In the case of Welsh, for instance, are there Welsh films? Are there Welsh dances? Are there Welsh novels? Are there Welsh poems? Are there Welsh television programs, radio programs? Is there Welsh on the internet? All of this. And the answer is, well, 20 or 30 years ago, not very much. And today, a huge amount. So this is really in my mind, actually, the greatest solution of all, because that's what interests people. People are interested in the arts, whatever the art might be. It might be dance, it might be sculpture, it could be anything. To what extent are the arts in the endangered communities you're faced with in Pakistan or wherever it might be, to what extent are the arts being used in order to focus public attention on the existence of the endangered languages, or to actually do something in relation to the endangered language? Are there paintings relating to the endangered language? Are there dances relating to the endangered language? Linguistically, are there poems and novels and plays written in the endangered language? And the answer is, for many endangered languages, not very much. And that's where so much attention needs to be focused, it seems to me, and not just me. I mean, this is something that's been going on since, well, at least 2003, when UNESCO had a conference in Paris, and the role of the arts was seen to be one of the most important facilitating factors in getting an endangered language alive and within the community. So I think it's so important to use the arts as a channel for the endangered language as much as possible. This means a bit of money, of course. The interest has to be there, bottom up, but there also has to be top down interest from artistic groups, from philanthropists, from governments, local governments. But in Wales here, this has been a hugely successful movement. There is now a very strong, successful movement in Wales, fostering the arts in Welsh at our community centre just down the road from where I live. Every now and then I will be able to see a play in Welsh, or have an evening of poems in Welsh, or a dance group comes along and talks the evening through in Welsh and in English, of course, it's bilingual. But as a result, Welsh is there within the artistic life of the community. And the more one can foster that locally around the endangered languages of Pakistan, the more likely there will be for a good future for these languages.
Well, thanks very much, Professor David Crystal. I think we've lost Ralph for a moment. So I see this question from Fernando from Brazil, and he asks, what can we do to save or protect a language? How important is this?
Well, there are two questions here, really. How important is it? There is nothing more important.
Yep.
I'm a linguist. What else would you expect me to say? But it is true, isn't it? Language is the main identity that we have as individuals and as a community. When one loses a language, a life is lost, as it were. A history is lost, an identity is lost. And the more we can do to foster that, the better. This is such an important issue. So any endangered language movement around the world has the full support of, well, increasing numbers of people, because they realize this, that language is so much part of their identity, their community identity, and their history. What can one do to foster that? Well, do what you're doing at the moment. And similarly, in other countries of the world, the endangered language movement is very, very strong now. There are associations in different parts of the world to do with endangered languages, and they're hugely successful because they are focusing public attention on the existence of the problem. They are persuading governments to put some money into the problem, so that, because it does cost money to save a language. Of course it does. You can't just save a language just like that. The money has to be there in terms of local government facilities, bilingual translation facilities, school books in schools, and all the other factors that have to be present in order to make sure that the language is alive in the community. So the interest is solidly growing around the world. I mean, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there was nothing. not even any books, introduce it. My book called Language Death was one of the first in 2001 to try to draw the attention of the world to the existence of the problem. It was very much a kind of academically a specialist area. And so many countries around the world were simply unaware of the existence of the problem. Well, the surveys that were done at that time showed the dramatic situation that there's a language dying out in the world every, 3 months or so on average. 3 months or so. Used to be, as I said at the beginning of this talk, 2 weeks. But no, it's more like 3 months. Well, that's the situation we're faced with. And slowly, thanks to UNESCO and other organizations and organizations like yours, people are becoming increasingly aware of the severity of the problem and doing something about it. So there are now some very successful examples of what's called language revitalization around the world. Welsh, my other language here, is a perfect example of that. And so, I wish you all well with this initiative in your part of the world. It will succeed, given the enthusiasm that is quite evident from those of you who are organizing this. It takes time, it takes energy, and it takes money, so local governments have to be involved. But there are enough success stories around the world to suggest that, there is grounds for optimism that you will be able to make significant progress in Pakistan and in adjoining countries.
Thank you so much. Can we ask further questions, or is it enough? Am I audible?
And David, Turab is asking if we could ask some more questions.
Yes, it's coming up to lunchtime here, but I have a little time. Yes.
Sure. Some more questions.
Okay. We'll just ask 1 or 2 questions. Is dialect saving as important as language saving?
Is what? Sorry.
Is dialect saving as important as language saving?
Oh, yes. I mean, dialect. What is the difference between a dialect and a language? As they used to say, a dialect becomes a language when it has an army and a navy to support it. In other words, power turns a dialect into a language. We've seen this in so many parts of the world, like Yugoslavia, for instance, which once upon a time had dialects of Serbian and Croatian and Montenegrin and so on. And now these are all separate languages. Why? Because they have power, because they have political identity and so on. So the situation is one where we need to maintain as much as possible a focus on the way in which dialects have an identity of their own. There is no difference essentially between a dialect and a language in terms of the cultural community and so on and so forth. As I say, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. It's power that turns a dialect into a language. And so the same amount of attention needs to be focused on the local dialects of a community, as well as the dialect that has achieved the power, has become the standard dialect and thus the standard language of the community. And it's a very important issue. I'm glad you've raised it, because when you go to a community which has an endangered language, often what you find is that there are several endangered dialects of that language spoken within the area. And one of the big difficulties actually is ensuring that these dialects don't fight each other. And people at one end of the village say, this is the correct way for our language to be saved. And people at the other end of the village say, no, this is the correct way for our language to be saved. And they start fighting each other, as it were. linguistically. That shouldn't happen. I mean, in an ideal world, that shouldn't happen. Both varieties are valuable. They're there for historical reasons, for ethnic reasons. Ethnicity is very important here because sometimes different ethnic groups have different dialects. But you can't teach them all. You need to respect them all, but you also have to respect the fact that there has to be a standard language, a way of being mutually intelligible for everybody. And so the situation is the same as in Britain, really, only in a very small scale way as far as these endangered communities are concerned. In Britain, we have standard English. Well, in the world, we have standard English. And then we have local dialects all over the place, each with their dialect societies, each with their dialect literature. And as a result, everybody becomes bilingual in English. Let me put it that way, or bidialectal in English. I am bidialectal in English. I am speaking to you now in standard English. When we finish this interaction and I go into my community here in Wales, I will switch into a local Welsh English kind of dialect. My pronunciation will change, my grammar will change a little, my vocabulary will change a little. There'll be more Welsh words brought into my speech. I have both of these in here. In fact, I have more than two varieties in my head because I have lived in several places and each of these places has left a dialect presence in my head. All of these, in my view, are equal, but one is more equal than all the others because it has become the standard language that I use when talking, for example, to you people today. So the more you can foster dialect awareness as well as language awareness, the better. And the reason is very, very simple. What is the difference between a dialect and a language socially? It's a matter of identity. Language is there to enable the widest possible community to understand each other. A dialect is there to show that there is a local community that is different from the broader community. And when those two things are in conflict, it's a sad situation. No, one wants to be as far as possible bidialectal or tridialectal or multidialectal. In other words, you have the standard language and you have your local language. You respect both. You give facilities to both. You don't denigrate one at the expense of the other. And the more that that kind of situation can be fostered, the better. It isn't possible sometimes for economic reasons to give equal attention to all the dialects in a community, but the more one can foster dialect as well as the standard language, the more that community is likely to have a positive linguistic future, in my view.
I see an interesting question here, and it says, when do we say that a language is endangered? Number of speakers are, any other factors?
The main factor is intergenerational transmission. In other words, passing the language between the generations. It doesn't much matter how many people there are. You can have a very small number of people who speak a language. So long as they pass it on through their children to the next generation, that language is safe. There are many languages around the world with very few speakers, and they are not endangered. No, an endangered situation comes when, for whatever reason, we've talked about some of these earlier on, the older generation fails to pass the language on to the younger generation, or the other way around, the younger generation doesn't feel the need to learn the language of the older generation. So, that is the scenario one is trying to avoid. And there is only one way of ensuring that a young generation wants to learn the older generation's language, and that is to make it relevant to them. And how do you make anything relevant to young people? I mean, that's the challenge. It isn't a linguistic problem only. What are young people interested in? Well, as well as I do, pop music, sex, all the usual things. So the language has got to be part of their interest range. Now, this has happened here in Wales. This is such an important thing. There are pop groups that sing in Welsh. You know, that alone made the language relevant for the younger generation. There are youth clubs that operate through Welsh. There are sports organizations that operate with Welsh, and so on. You have to look at it the other way around, not starting with the language and going to the young people, but start with the young people, ask them what they are interested in. Well, we know to some extent, but get their opinions on the matter, and then see ways in which the language side can be incorporated into their reality. If that happens, it's a very successful outcome for the language. But without that intergenerational transmission, a language has no future.
Thank you. We have a last question. The last question is, how can a language with no or less instrumental value be revitalized, while the speaker of such languages are more willing and eager to adopt a language of power and prestige like English? I mean, what effort can be put to change the ideology towards inclination of English?
Yes, absolutely. And not just English, of course, because the same situation happens with Spanish in South America, and Portuguese and Chinese, and your main languages in the subcontinent. It's the same situation for all of them. But most of the literature and the research has been done in relation to English. That's true. And so one can learn from that experience. And the situation is one of essentially mutual respect. We're talking about identity versus intelligibility. And there is no necessary opposition between these two things. Why does one have a standard language? Why does one have an international language? To foster intelligibility, mutual intelligibility amongst the people within a community, or now internationally and worldwide. English is now a world language, has been for some time. And the reason for its dominance is not just historical reasons, but because the world finds it useful to have an international language. At the moment, it is English. May not always be. One day, other factors, political, social, and others, may change that, and there will be a different universal language. If we get taken over by aliens, we might all be speaking Martian one day as an international language. Who knows? But the point is that that language is there to guarantee international intelligibility. At the same time, we need languages that express the other dominant force within a community, which is the need for identity. And all languages have that identity force driving them. Endangered languages, of course, as much as anything else. So it's this balance between intelligibility and identity that's crucial to maintain. How is it done? It's done in all sorts of ways, through society as a whole, in the schools in particular, a notion of mutual respect for all languages has to be part of the philosophy, the ethos of a community. That can be done very easily in schools. These days, if one goes to a language course in a British school, for instance, often there are courses on identity and equality and mutual respect and the importance of dialects and all that sort of thing, which helps to develop that kind of mindset about the importance of linguistic responsibility. So there has to be that kind of balance between intelligibility and identity. And if one can maintain that sort of balance with respect going in both directions, then the situation is really quite optimistic. it's a difficult one for some parts of the world where only the intelligibility criterion has been held to be important, and where there has, frankly, been a sense of threat from the minority communities that if they were given too much power, they would then be a threat to the majority community. Well, language is bound up with politics in that kind of way. And, it's difficult to generalize, therefore, when we're faced with situations like that. But in the best scenario, we're dealing with one where the language of intelligibility is not in conflict with the languages of identity, the languages or dialects of identity, and a sort of happy balance comes to be maintained. I think we've reached that here in Wales and in many other parts of the world too, but it's always a tension for countries where there is not a tradition of respecting local dialects. And it's one that, an organization like yours is going to be able to do a great deal of help to support the identity of the communities that you're involved with and to foster their languages.
Great. I see another question, and it says, do we have number of endangered languages? We have now any statistics?
The number of endangered languages?
Yes. How many endangered languages are there in the world?
Yeah, difficult to say. Thanks to these movements around the world, which are turning some endangered languages fortunes around. But the figure that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, somewhere between 20% and 80% of the world's languages are endangered. So the average is round about 50%, meaning that there is an endangered language likely to die every 3 months or so on average, is the received wisdom at the moment. It all depends on the surveys that are being done in various parts of the world, of course, and keeping these surveys up to date. But if you go to some of the online organizations like Ethnologue and explore the latest research, it's difficult research to keep information about because there are so many communities around the world and not all of them receive study. But the figure I use is that something like half the world's languages are so seriously endangered that they are likely to die out in the course of the next century unless something is done. And that means a language dying out every 3 months or so on average. And that does seem to be the rate at which languages are disappearing at the moment. But the movements to recognize, respect, and foster minority languages have been dramatic in the last 20 years. So it is possible that a greater number of these seriously endangered languages will survive. But even if they don't, the important thing is not just revitalization, but documentation. If you document an endangered language, then at some point in the future, remember that fourth generation effect I talked about a little while ago? If at some point in the future, the community wants its language back, if it has been well documented, they can have it back. And so it's very important for organizations that deal with endangered languages to maintain that balance between the two big initiatives: revitalization, where it's possible, and documentation, where linguists and others can these days record as much of the language as possible, get it written down, and do all the things that's necessary to maintain a record for the future.
Keeping in mind
Thank
the
you so
current
much.
status of English, do you think, it will be an endangered language?
English?
Yes.
Oh, yes, absolutely. If they, remember I mentioned the Martians, if they take over one day, we may all be speaking Martian. Who knows? No, any external pressures can change a language from being an international or universal language, and it can disappear. I mean, French was the dominant international language once upon a time. English is at the moment. In 1,000 years, it could be anything. it could be Chinese, it could be Arabic, it could be Hindi. It all depends on the future power, politics, and economics of the world. Language has no separate existence from the social and economic and political forces that give rise to it. And it's perfectly possible for English one day to cease to be an international language. There's no sign of it happening at the moment. On the contrary, the numbers of people speaking English around the world are growing. The current wisdom is that something like 2.3 billion people around the world use English. That's a third of the world's population. The numbers are still growing. They're not growing as rapidly as they did 20 or 30 years ago, but they are still growing. So there's no sign of any strong alternative to English at the moment. But that could change.
Yes, I've always wondered, why at government level, policy level, multilingualism is seen as a threat. What would you, say on it?
Seen as a threat?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there is that attitude around. There are, language relates to power, language relates to identity, and there have been so many cases in history of people seeing other languages as a threat and therefore wanting to eliminate them in order to maintain the focus on a single language. That has happened everywhere throughout history. There's no change, no novelty about that. But these days, I think we have a more enlightened view of language, the concept of multilingualism. Remember that 3/4 of the world's population is still multilingual, is bilingual at least. Multilingualism is the normal human condition. To be monolingual is the exception. And monolingualism tends to come with colonialism and imperialism and so on. So it's a very natural situation for humans to be bilingual, trilingual, multilingual. And therefore, the more we recognize that and the more we foster it, the more I think we are simply re-establishing the human condition that is, the brain is ready for many languages. That's the thing. The brain can cope with several languages. As you know, some people have learned 40 or 50 languages, and most people in the world have at least 2 or 3 languages at their disposal, let alone the dialects. So it's a very natural human condition. And the more we can foster it, the better, it seems to me.
Great. Thanks, Frank. Appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We are thankful to you for your precious time and for this great session. And we are also thankful to all the participants who join us from different regions of the world. Inshallah, we'll have sessions like that in future as well. We'll arrange webinars and web talks on language endangerment in future as well. And we're also trying for a language documentation workshop in next month. So hope our scholars will join this language documentation workshop as well. So I'm thankful to all of you. Thanks to Amanullah for collaboration and for his help, for his assistance. And thanks to, again, I'm thankful to Professor David Crystal on behalf of our community, on behalf of our participants. We can imagine the level of the love of our community from the registration of our webinar. And also most of our participants are requesting to invite David Crystal to Pakistan, to visit Pakistan. And in future, we'll see David Crystal in Pakistan.
Well, that would be lovely, though my age is making it difficult to travel these days. But I thank you for your interest. I certainly applaud your initiative in the focus on endangered languages. It's a really important initiative, obviously being very successful. Give you my best wishes for the future. And as everybody says these days when they're signing off an international encounter like this, stay safe.
Thank you.
Mr.
Thank you.
Professor David Crystal, His Excellency, it was wonderful to have you, such an honor. I feel humbled, privileged, delighted, and thank you so much, Saurabh, for this honor and opportunity. Thank you very much, Professor David Crystal.
Been a
Thank you.
pleasure.